Hey fam, what's good? What's good? I hope the show well and keeping safe. Welcome back to another one. Welcome back to another one. I hope you all had an amazing day. Hope you all had an amazing weekend, and I hope you all are prepared for this coming week as well when it comes down to the Nasdaq. So you know what? Starting off from our top-down analysis, starting from our monthly time frame, right? We still do have 18 days and 10 hours for this candle to find itself closing. Now, many might like previously inside my content, I said that if we are going to find ourselves having somewhat of an actual bullish momentum, right, creating a higher high as we are currently doing, right, we expect somewhat of an actual pullback. Right now, just to clarify, the pullback is not necessarily saying that we are going to find ourselves having something like this happening, right, a correction find itself happening, right. Basically what I mean is we can see somewhat of an actual pushback towards the downside and then have a further continuation move back towards the upside, right, as we are still bullish in market structure. And we can see from our previous 2 months, right, look at the wicks, right, we can see that our bulls has been flexing the muscles hard, right. So I'm expecting us to have somewhat of an actual wick thrown towards the downside before having somewhat of an actual pushback towards the upside. For example, right, look at this strong bullish momentum. There we had a nice little wick thrown towards the downside, right? There we had a nice little wick thrown towards the downside. There we had a nice little wick thrown towards the downside. However, we still had the bullish momentum find itself coming through, right? So we can see that, hey, the tail is starting to become a little bit longer, right? So there is somewhat of an actual signal that we can potentially have somewhat of an actual pushback towards the downside. Right now we are finding ourselves monitoring price basically from the weekly, daily, and 4-hourly time frame, right? So we will basically emphasis more on what is happening on our weekly time frame downwards, right? So looking at our weekly time frame, we can see that, hey, we had somewhat of an actual back and forth throughout this week, right? This candle, honestly, it doesn't mean anything to me, right? Even though it closed red, it might be like, oh, okay, cool. You know what? We can potentially have somewhat of an actual shift back towards the downside. But if we are going to look at the high of this candle, the high of that candle, they are quite relatively the same, right? So there's still that possibility of us having somewhat of an actual pushback towards the upside, right? Our market sentiment is still strong bullish, right? They are still bullish when it comes down to the Nasdaq. However, one thing you need to take into consideration when looking at the COT data is that it's gonna look from an overall momentum, right? It's more of an actual long term, it's more of a swing position. So let's say, for instance, if we are going to find ourselves having somewhat of an actual shove back towards the downside, the COT report will basically tell us that, hey, you know what, some longs has been taken off the contract, but in overall, you know what, we are still finding ourselves being long overall on the Nasdaq, right? But if we really have to find ourselves changing market structure to bearish, then only we can be like, okay, cool, we are gonna find ourselves looking for some beautiful shorts, right? But as of now, we are still finding ourselves being quite strongly bullish, right? So all I'm basically gonna find myself doing is to simply move with market structure, right? So first of all, we can see that we had this beautiful shift towards the upside. I'm gonna find myself boxing out this BOB out once again, right? These lower magnets over here, we will find ourselves concentrating on that if we can see some clear bearish momentum find itself opening up, right? So I'm gonna find myself boxing out our previous points of interests once again, right? We basically find ourselves boxing out this area over here as well, serving as an actual area of demand, right? Serving as an area of demand. Well, let's move on, right? Serving as an area of demand, and then we can basically see for this week we basically did find ourselves having somewhat of an actual range market as well, right? We had a whole lot of back and forth when it comes down to this little section as we had right over here. Now, one thing we also made mention is that, you know what, there is still that possibility for us having that push towards the upside, since we are still finding ourselves being within an actual BOB, right? But now let's look at what is finding itself happening on the NASDAQ, right? So like I might mention, right, these highs over here, they are quite relatively equal in my eyes. So we definitely need to find ourselves seeing these highs being taken out, right? They are quite relatively equal highs in my eyes. Okay, now looking at these candles we have found ourselves creating right over here, looking at wick structure, we can basically see we had a high, lower high, lower high, right? Looking at our lows, we can see that we did find ourselves having a low, higher low, lower low, right? So our wick structure is basically telling us that, hey, there is a potential short that we can find ourselves having when it comes down to the NASDAQ, right? Keep that word in mind, potential, right? Because the same thing basically happened over here, right? Check this out. We had a high, lower high, lower high, right? We had a low, higher low, lower low. However, we still find ourselves having that actual shift back towards the upside, okay? But the only difference is that if we're going to zoom price in just a little bit more, we can see that we actually did find ourselves taking out this high right over there as well, right? Slightly, right? But we did find ourselves taking out the high. We did find ourselves taking out liquidity, right? So there is that possibility for us having that actual shift back towards the downside from this area onwards as well, right? And that is basically something that I am favoring, right? I am starting to find myself looking for some shorts to find itself opening up when it comes down to the NASDAQ. All right, so looking at my 4 hourly time frame, enable for me to have somewhat of an actual a short finding itself coming through, or wanting to see the daily go down, wanting to see the weekly go down, my 4 hourly time frame needs to be bearish in market structure as well, right? And are we currently bearish in market structure? No, we are not, right? We are still finding ourselves being within somewhat of an actual range, right? Let me show y'all. On the 4 hourly time frame, we will always see it so much clear, right? Respect, 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 right? We are inside of a range market when it comes down to our H4 time frame. So no, we aren't bearish when it comes down to our actual H4 time frame. However, we can find ourselves looking at potential points of interest that, you know what, we can have an actual eye out on. And what is the one thing that I am finding myself looking out for is basically equal lows and equal highs, right? Equal lows, equal highs. So over here, we can basically see that we are having somewhat of equal lows coming through. I'm going to find myself boxing that out. Bang. Just like that. Okay. Now, what do I always say? If we have an equal low, if we have an equal high, I'm always finding myself looking for somewhat of an actual untested magnet below or above price. Okay, now let's look at the equal highs first. Do we have any records where we can be like, okay, this is an actual area, we're gonna look at this magnet, this one right there? No, we can't, because there's no data, right? There's nothing being presented to us. However, when it comes down to our shorts, is there any magnets that is telling us that we can potentially see price have somewhat of a reaction from a certain area? Is there? Yes, right? Right over here. This whole area over here is serving as an area of demand, right? I want you guys to also take into consideration that I did find myself boxing out this area the previous week as well, right? As a point of interest to where I would love to see the NASDAQ find itself coming into as well, if we can have that proper change in market structure, right? Equal lows. Bang. Let me just mark that off as well. Just like that. Now we do have a whole lot of magnets below price, right? And I can't find myself, going into all of them. But as if now, let's just focus on what we currently do have in front of us. Okay, so we can clearly see that we do have some equal lows coming through. So an area that I will also find myself boxing out will basically be this previous gap we have found ourselves opening up right over here, right? Which will basically serve as somewhat of an actual volume imbalance for me, right? However, it's not really a volume imbalance, but you know what, this area can find itself serving as somewhat of an area of resistance if we can see that actual shift back towards the downside, right? How somewhat often we can even tap within our actual area of demand, has somewhat of an actual shift back towards the upside. If we can see a proper change in market structure from this area on our lower time frame as well, then there is a high possibility for us coming all the way back down, back into our equal lows right over here as well, right? So for those who has been watching me for a while, let's see if you have been paying attention, right? So looking at this equal low we have found ourselves creating over here, I want you to pause this video, right? Pause it, please do pause it. Right, pause the video and try and identify where is a next area, right? The next area, basically saying where's the next magnet that it can find itself heading into if we can see these equal lows being taken out. Right there. Bang. A nice little BOB we have found ourselves created, right? We never came back for the retest back within that region right over there. So you know what, if we can see the short find itself coming through on the NASDAQ, this is what I am preparing for, right? This is what I am preparing for. If we can see that break below, right, I will start monitoring price right inside this region right over here. And then after that, right, I will find myself then wanting to see a price has somewhat of an actual shift back towards the downside. It would be great if we can see the shift back down, back into our area of demand, respect our area of demand, come all the way back up in our volume imbalance, respect our volume imbalance, and then have an actual shift back towards the downside, back into our BOB. That is one thing that I will find myself having my eye out on when it comes down to the NASDAQ, right? And that is basically what I am finding myself preparing myself for right now. One thing I always take into consideration is that, you know what, if we don't change market structure by Wednesday, you know what, there is a high possibility for us then having that beautiful longs then finding itself opening up, because you know what, the long will literally then present itself within market structure. All right, so that is my outlook for this coming week. Let me know in the comment section, what is your thoughts? Are you bullish? Are you bearish when it comes down to the NASDAQ? I am curious to know. It's me, your boy D. I'm gonna see y'all in the next one. I'm out.